This is part number 60, preparation for exam NSE4 Fortinet. And now we continue with IP pool types. There are four types of IP pools. We already talked about overload and one-to-one. So let's talk about fixed port range and port block allocation types. IP pool type, fixed port range. Internet service providers must be able to identify the subscribers responsible for given connection should authorities require it. If the Internet service provider performs NAT, network address translation, to subscriber traffic, then the traffic will share one or more public addresses. One way to track the traffic and therefore the NAT details for each connection is by logging them. However, this can result in a huge number of resources. The more logs we collect, the more resources we consume. And internet service providers need to dedicate for log purposes only. And another option to deploy CGN focused feature, such as fixed port range IP pool. Fixed port range IP pools enable administrators to track connections by public addresses and port without having to log every session. When you configure a fixed port range IP pool, then we indicate a range of external IP addresses that FortiGate uses to perform NAT on traffic sourced from a range of internal IP addresses. So let's say we have a number of internal IP addresses. For example, internal address range from 10.0.1.1 to 10.0.1.253, and it maps to the range of external IP addresses 70.70.71 to 70.70.70.80. So this way, FortiGate shares 10 external IP addresses to 253 internal IP addresses. And this is called fixed port range because FortiGate calculates the port block size and the number of available port blocks for the IP pool based on the number of configured internal and external IP addresses. FortiGate then allocates one or more port blocks to internal hosts when performing network address translation, which is that enables the administrators to track each connection without having to log them. And we can use command using command line interface, diagnose firewall IP pool list. This command is used to identify the block size and number of blocks assigned to each external IP address in fixed port range IP pool. We can also use another command, diagnose firewall IP pool fixed range list net IP. This command is used to view detailed external address and port assignment information per internal address. The result, we can identify subscribers by providing the public address and port of a connection. Fourth type of NAT, of dynamic IP pools, is port block allocation. It's an IP pool type. The port block allocation IP pool is also a useful option of CGN. It gives administrators more flexible way to control user port allocation for network address translation. Unlike the fixed port range IP pool, which requires us to define internal and external IP address ranges, the port block allocation, we define the external IP address range only. We must also indicate the block port size and number of blocks that FortiGate allocates to each host or source IP address. The result of each source IP address is limited to the number of blocks and port configured in the IP pool. So this prevents port exhaustion caused by a few hosts. For logging purposes, when FortiGate allocates a port block to a host, it generates a system log, event log, to inform the administrator. And administrator can then look at the system event logs to identify internet connections made by a device should the authorities require such information. That is, like the fixed port block case, administrator doesn't have to log the traffic for connection identification purposes. The example is FortiGate allocates port blocks on a first come, first served basis. The port allocation is made when FortiGate receives a packet from unserved hosts. For example, IP addresses 10.0.1.10 and 10.0.1.33 are unserved hosts that try to access the internet. FortiGate then allocates the port blocks to each host and performs respective SNAT on traffic, source NAT on traffic. Upon allocation, FortiGate also generates system event logs with the port block allocation details to inform the administrator. Note that the system event logs occur when we check IP pools. For example, that the name of the IP pool, we can check type of it, start IP, end IP, block size, and number blocks per user. VIPs, VIP. VIPs are virtual IPs. They are IP addresses that does not correspond to a physical network interface. VIPs uses for VIPs including NAT, fault tolerance, and mobility. VIPs are DNAT objects. For sessions matching a VIP, the destination address is translated. Usually a public internet address is translated to private network address of a server. VIPs are selected in the firewall policy destination field. The default VIP type is static NAT. This is a one-to-one mapping. This means that, first, FortiGate performs DNAT on ingress traffic destined to the external IP address defined in a VIP, regardless of the protocol and port of the connection, provided the matching firewall policy reference the VIP as destination. FortiGate second uses network address translation IP, the external IP address defined in the VIP when performing SNAT of all egress traffic sourced from the mapped address in the VIP, provided the matching firewall policy has network address translation enabled. That is, FortiGate doesn't use the egress interface address as NAT IP. Note that we can override the behavior described in step 2 using an IP pool. We can also select FQDN fully qualified domain name as type. When we select FQDN, we can configure FQDN address objects as external and external IP addresses. This enables FortiGate to automatically update the external and internal IP addresses used by the VIP in case the FQDN resolved address range. Optionally, we can also enable port forwarding on the VIP to instruct FortiGate to redirect the traffic matching the external address and port in the VIP to the mapped internal address and port. When we enable port forwarding, FortiGate no longer performs one-to-one mapping. This means that we can reuse the same external address and map it to different internal address, and port provided in the external port is unique. So we can configure another VIP, so connections to the external IP on the same port mapped to internal IP. For example, VIP example static NAT incoming connection. For example, here we have host initiates a connection to 70.70.70.71 on TCP port 443. On FortiGate, the traffic matches the firewall policy ID 1, which references web server ext VIP as destination. Because the VIP is configured as static NAT and has port forwarding disabled, then FortiGate translates the destination address of the packet 172.16.1.10 from 70.70.70.71. And note that the destination port doesn't change because port forwarding is disabled. Also note that the external interface address is different from the external address configured in the VIP. This is not a problem as long as the upstream network has its routing property set. We can also enable ARP reply on the VPN, Virtual Private Network, enabled by default to facilitate routing on the upstream network. Thank you. See you in the next video.